Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome New York Times national education reporter Motoko Rich and panelists John McWhorter and Angel Pérez.
So thank you so much for being here, and we're really excited to talk to you about affirmative action, which is obviously a very hot topic, particularly in college admissions. And this year, the Supreme Court may be ruling, but until then, we are the deciders. So we're going to talk about what we think would be appropriate in affirmative action. So we're going to start with John. A couple years ago in a New York Magazine piece, you wrote, "Because racial preferences can be as toxic as they can be beneficial, affirmative action should be applied like chemotherapy, as quickly and narrowly as possible because of the damage it does amid the healing." That's pretty striking and strident. So are you basically saying that affirmative action is bad and painful now and no longer useful?
Oh, I don't think it's strident at all. It's a highly controversial and very delicate thing, and that doesn't mean that it isn't right. And I completely agree with affirmative action being based primarily on race in the 1960s and 70s, given where the country was at that time. But I think that there's an unspoken assumption among many that, and I've heard this often said, you don't stop racial preferences until there is no racism or discrimination in society. I don't believe that. I believe that with a policy like that, given how difficult it is, and I didn't mean toxic as strident. I meant it as an empirical description of an unfortunate but ineluctable reality. Given what it is, you have to think of it as chemotherapy. It's something that you apply carefully. And in brief, to apply racial preferences on the basis of discrimination and obstacles makes perfect sense. To apply racial preferences on the basis of a commitment to diversity, where the idea is that diversity is something that justifies changing one's conceptions of qualifications per particular segment of an incoming class, I don't think that's a good idea. I think
let's talk specifics.
It should be about socioeconomic.
So what do you mean by that? Meaning that when you say changing qualifications, you meaning lowering the bar for certain categories of people based on
very much
characteristics?
Yeah, I think that it is a bad thing to have diversity where the unspoken understanding is that people who are, we might call diverse, are not going to be subject to the same grades qualifications and are going to be allowed in with significantly lower test scores than other students. I think that that is a questionable policy.
And is this something that comes from personal experience? Because I know you have yourself been the beneficiary of race-based affirmative action, both in grad school and in your postdoctoral program. Did you feel that somehow you were perceived differently? Is that where some of this comes from? Or is it more what you saw in students that you taught?
Oh, I certainly was perceived differently, but that wasn't my motivation. I became a politicized person late in the game. I didn't grow up thinking about these issues. And once I did, my motivation wasn't, oh dear, I don't like the way people are looking at me. Frankly, I didn't care, and I wish more people did not care about things like that. But the issue was that if you decide that you're going to create a diverse class, but then you end up having what is, in effect, a two-tier system, then for one thing, the people who are on the lower tier don't have a way of getting better at what we're hoping that they'll get better at doing. And certainly, it wasn't a personal issue, but certainly people are going to get the feeling, based on what goes on at the school, that there's something wrong with these people in general. They might not want to say it out loud, or only a certain kind of person is going to, but certainly it's there. And so I feel that the diversity idea, when the idea is that diversity is something that is more important than qualifications, ends up being quite simply what was put in the 1960s and 70s as tokenism. We don't apply that word, but it's the exact same thing.
And what do you think, Angel, as someone who's in charge of developing a class at Trinity and in the room when admissions decisions are made, what do you think about whether or not race should still be part of the conversation?
I actually think it should be part of the conversation, and part of it is because I don't think we've come far enough in this country. I think all of the incidents that have happened in this country regarding race, particularly this summer and even yesterday with Ahmed in Texas, really leads us to believe that we have a long way to go. And I'll preface this by saying that, you know, my own personal story informs my work. And so I also am a product of affirmative action. I grew up in Puerto Rico, moved to the projects of the South Bronx, was admitted to an institution, a quote-unquote elite liberal arts institution in upstate New York, whether it was because I was Latino or whether it was because I was low income, not sure. But that opportunity really fundamentally changed my life, and I actually wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't. So part of it is that I don't think we've come far enough, and the other piece is that as an enrollment manager, someone who is charged with putting together a freshman class, I also have a responsibility to the institution to make sure it's a diverse place that represents the world around them. If we didn't take any race into consideration, and by the way, we also do take class into consideration. This is a part of the conversation, so it's not one or the other. But if we didn't do that, I think we would be doing a disservice to our young people, because colleges should be a great place for them to begin to interact with students of all different backgrounds.
Well, let's talk about class. You say in your own case, you don't even know whether it was because you were Latino or because it was you came from a low-income family in the South Bronx. Can class be used? Is it an effective tool to supplant race in affirmative action? Can we simply use class and get as diverse a class and achieve all the goals of helping students who come from disadvantage, who faced obstacles, but also to redress past wrongs? Can class be an effective tool to form a class?
I think it's a tool, but it isn't something that we could use to not take diversity into consideration.
Why not?
Part of it is because when we look at creating a freshman class and we're looking at students with all these different backgrounds, we definitely take a big part of our conversation is what are the opportunities that were afforded to a student in the process. And so we may be looking, for example, at two families who are African American, but one, of the families, both parents are doctors, are not necessarily first generation, obviously, so on and so forth, and then another family who maybe grew up the way I did in the projects of the South Bronx. And so we are going to take that piece of the conversation into account, but I think if we only focused on class, we're probably missing another piece of the diversity as well. I'm not sure that the class that I bring in every year would look the same if we just focused on class.
Well, that's interesting because I looked up the statistics on UC Irvine, which topped the New York Times College Index as doing the best job in recruiting people from lower socioeconomic groups. And this is what the racial makeup of the university is. It's 48.3% Asian, 1.9% Black African American, 23.9% Hispanic Latino, and 18.7% white. And just so you know how that represents California, Latinos are more than half of public school enrollment, and Blacks are more than 6%. So John, what do you think about, you've talked about socioeconomic factors being the best way to determine whether someone should have a leg up, as it were, in the admissions process. Hearing those statistics, does that seem appropriate to you?
Well, I want to say this. Diversity is important. I've written about that too within a particular context where everybody's qualifications are more or less the same. It is quite urgent. But in terms of whether there needs to be a direct correlation between the diversity within a school and the diversity within the state and its particular history, I'm not sure I completely understand that. And as much as I hate to say this, this is not a savory thing to say. The arguments for the importance of diversity in the educational experience are extremely, no offense, Angel, at all, really, but they are extremely under-argued, really. Patricia Gurin's report, if any of you are familiar with that, read it and really see if that's an argument for why it's important that a certain proportion of brown students be at one school. I don't see what that has to do with learning French irregular verbs or what systolic pressure is. Now, maybe there's an argument I haven't seen, but there are times when the argument hasn't been made that firmly. But just more to the point, socioeconomics is crucial. If somebody has had obstacles in life, and they don't have to be incredible, searing obstacles. If somebody's had obstacles in life, yes, affirmative action, racial preferences, of course you're not going to have the same standards. That counts for a Black student, that counts for a Latino student, that counts for a white student. Nothing feels righter. When I was at UC Berkeley now 400 years ago, when I was there, during the last 2 years, I was on admissions committees where we had to take what was called hardship into account. And so kind of the coal miner's daughter kind of person, the white, underprivileged person. It felt correct that now affirmative action was about that as well.
Well, let's talk about that question of whether or not elite universities in particular are taking into account socioeconomics and obstacles. There was an op-ed in the New York Times over the weekend by Anthony Abraham Jack, and he noted that half of the lower income black undergraduates at elite colleges come from private high schools like Andover and Dalton. So they've already been sort of pre-selected. They have gone through, they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, but they have come through programs where they've had quite a lot of privilege in high school. And so it seems as if the elite colleges are really sort of tapping into an already privileged pool when they're making these decisions. So is there something that elite colleges, and I don't know what the statistics are at Trinity, but are you doing really enough, you know, are you paying lip service to going after the most disadvantaged students, or are you really aggressively going after the most disadvantaged students?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think colleges can always be doing more. And we're, you know, the conversation, I think, even in the past 5 years has really shifted, you know, and part of it has to do with the political attention that being a first-generation student is now really calling. For example, Michelle Obama's Reach Higher initiative. And so I think that's really put a lot more accountability on colleges and universities to go out and not only, you know, recruit low-income first-generation students at schools like the Andovers of the world, even though I would say most of us have been doing that for a long time. But I think there's a little bit more accountability now for us to go, and also to be looking at parts of the country where we normally would not look at, you know, smaller cities, rural areas, to really diversify, once again, not only on class and race, but also the experience that these students bring in based on where they grew up.
And can we also talk about what we're trying to do here for the students is we're trying to set them up for success throughout their lives, not just get them into an elite college. That shouldn't be the end game, of course.
Right.
And so what are colleges doing to support students so that they have the kind of social capital? There's a lot of talk about how the kids that come from the Andovers and the Daltons, they've already learned that you got to go to office hours, you got to advocate, you have to behave a certain way to get what you want in the world. And maybe someone who's grown up in the South Bronx, I don't know how if you could talk about your personal experience, whether you felt that you could sort of compete socially in a way, which sort of translates into your academic success in some ways and perhaps into your later economic success. Are the colleges doing enough to really help students navigate that kind of social realm?
Right. I think colleges are increasingly doing more and more. You know, the fact that we now, I just came from an institution where we created a orientation program for first-generation students. I think when I went to college, it was almost embarrassing. I would never have said, hi, I'm the first person to go to college and I'm from the projects of the South Bronx. I never would have walked around campus saying that. But the conversation is shifting, and part of it is because of all of the media attention. I was telling someone this story earlier that the institution, I'm new to Trinity. I just arrived at Trinity this year, but I was at the Claremont Colleges in Southern California for 11 years. And while I was there, one of the things I did was create a first-generation mentorship program as well as orientation program. And one of the students who participated this year sent me a button, and it says, I'm first. And all these kids are walking around campus wearing it, saying, I'm first. And there's this sense of pride in being a first-generation student. So I think things like that are really important because, you know, when I arrived, if it were not for the opportunity program at the institution that I went at, I would not have been able to really navigate, even had the social skills for what it was that I needed. There was a very different conversation taking place by majority students on our campus, and there was this level of knowledge that I just didn't have. And so having orientation programs that at least say to students, it's okay to have that conversation, even if you don't know the answer, is a great first step.
And what do you think about that, John? Because you've also said that you don't think some of the African-American students that you talk to at Columbia are that fragile. You've sort of talked about what does support mean? It seems very vague. Are these programs actually helpful in very specific ways in your students' lives?
Oh, definitely. And Motoko, if I may, I just want to be clear. When we had that exchange, you were saying, should there be more support? At which point I said, well, I'm not sure what that would be. But what support there is very important. People have different cultural experiences. It amazes me how some of my, what we might call undiverse students are almost viscerally trained to go to office hours, to know how to ask for a recommendation, all sorts of little practices that you don't even think of as cultural, that they're just born to. How would somebody know that from many other circumstances, including if you're talking about the middle class, whatever that always means, Black or Latino kid? So yeah, there do need to be support systems, there need to be clubs, there need to be mentors. I don't disagree with that. I just disagree with, I have a daughter. You can imagine what she looks like, because we have to be vivid. Think of Shirley Temple, now give her a really nice tan. That is exactly what my daughter looks like. The idea that in 16 years, somebody on some admissions committee is going to look at her and think, oh, she's diverse. We're going to bring her in when she's going to grow up hyper-educated and upper middle class in the 2000 teens and 20s. No affirmative action for her. But for people who really need it, oh yeah, you need it, and you have to give people support once they're there. College is hard.
What about, is college necessary? That is sort of a constant conversation, and what we're ultimately talking about in affirmative action is giving access to college as if we want more and more people to have access to college because it's a good thing. And there was a piece over the weekend looking at some federal statistics on what kids had paid for to go to college, or what their parents had paid to go to college, and what they were making 10 years out. And there's some pretty sober statistics, not just about what you might expect for profit universities and cosmetology schools where the graduates were still not making $25,000 a year 10 years out, but places like Bennington were on the list. So when we're talking about elite colleges and making sure that we give more access to a broader group of students, are we sending the right message by saying everybody should be trying for this prize?
Me?
Yes, John.
Yeah, wait, wrong message.
I see you're shaking your head.
It's wrong message. I'll put it carefully. Society requires a college degree for too many things, and I think we have gotten away from a respect for work and the default idea that to be a legitimate American person is to, after high school, spend 4 years attending classes diagonally related to anything that you're ever going to do, is inaccurate. That's one of the very few ways in which the old days were better. I think we need to get back to respect for vocational education in community colleges. The Obama administration is very good on this when they want to be, because I think that it really isn't worth it for a great many people. At Columbia, I have not encountered a student where I thought you don't belong in college, but that is Columbia. At UC Berkeley, quite frankly, state institution, there were many students where I thought, not you don't belong in college, get out of here, but I thought this person should have gone to a school where they learned how to do what they're really interested in for about 2 years and then gone out and done it and made about $80,000 or $90,000 a year. We need to talk more about that ironically good old-fashioned life trajectory, I think.
Do you have a thought on that, Angel?
Yeah, actually, I don't disagree that much. I mean, I think everyone who aspires to college should have the opportunity to do so, and we should figure out a way in this country to finance that. And so in higher education, we have a big responsibility towards that. But I also have seen, and part of this is just my own family members, people who thought, I'm doing this because that's what I'm supposed to do, but they were not passionate about it, didn't really care for it, and sometimes ended up on a college campus, and that experience for them was actually more destructive, because now they left, they feel like I'm incompetent, I'm not good enough. So I think providing opportunities for students to take different paths, but always leaving college as the option, I think is the way to go.
So better counseling in high school.
Much better counseling.
Let's take a couple
Looks like we have some questions here.
Oh.
I know that Art Rodriguez, who oversees admissions for Vassar, who's always scored well in on the diversity index that the website has published. Did you have a question, Art?
I do, yes. Thank you. So we've talked a lot about what we're trying to create on our college campuses in terms of diversity. But I also think about it from a different perspective of the fact that the world around us in terms of who's graduating from high school, the demographics of those students is also changing. Yep. And that in part what colleges are responsible for is ensuring that students who aspire to have a college education can have access to places like Vassar or Trinity or Columbia, not so much for what diversity brings in the classroom or in the residential community, but for the larger, greater good that it might have for our country in terms of how leaders, creative people, innovative people can really help shape what tomorrow looks like. So how do we balance the fact that most of the conversation tends to focus on what's happening on individual college and what might be the individual success for a person rather than this larger goal that I think we should be working towards.
Professor Rodriguez, what, if I take your meaning, you're saying that it's important to make sure that people in the workforce have experience with diversity because that's better for working together and for creating things. Am I correct?
Yes and no, but there's also a larger demographic shift that we're seeing too. And with that larger demographic shift, with having more Latinos and African American students graduating from high schools, and if we're not capturing them at places that are some of the elite, or and then the public elites and so forth, are we missing out on an opportunity to help place them in positions where they can really be seen as leaders in our country? Where right now I think that there's still we still struggle with that, particularly with many of the racial issues that we've been seeing in our country.
Angel, I think you're going to be better on this than me, but I will just say very briefly, I genuinely am not clear on why a person is less poised to become a leader if they graduate from the University of California at San Diego than from UCLA or Berkeley. I'm not sure what the evidence is that it's a sentence to mediocrity not to go to one of about 30 schools. I really might be missing something, though.
No, I agree with you, and it's funny, before you even answered, I said, part of what we have to do, besides those of us who work at these, the Trinities and the Vassars of the world, that we have a great responsibility to be very thoughtful and to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. I think part of the problem is that we live in this society in the United States where, for example, if you look at your program and look at the colleges and universities that are presenting here, most of us are in that elite sector. But however, we educate the smallest population of the United States. And so how are we going to begin to shift resources and also bring that prestige level up for the students who are going to the state universities, so on and so forth? But I agree with you that we at our small campuses, for example, the Columbias of the world as well, have a great responsibility to make sure that we're also keeping up with that demographic shift. Part of that, as you know, has huge financial implications. And as institutions of higher education, we have to have conversations on our campus about what kind of commitment are we really going to make? Because I think for most people in higher education, our heart is in the right place. Where we are lacking is the finance to make sure that we can bring that diversity to fruition.
Let me jump in. There's a question that came from Matthew Feinstein, and John, you won't be surprised to know many of the questions come for you. You're used to handling them. This comes from Matthew Feinstein, who asked, it sounds to him like one of the things that you're arguing is that the goal of college is to teach hard academic skills. What about teaching people the normalization of racial dynamics, about teaching them to operate, both minority students and non-minority students, to operate in diverse settings and to be able to function, which I think also gets to Mr. Rodriguez's question.
I don't know what that means. I mean, we live in a society where there are phrases that we use, and I'm not using this as a thrust parry. I don't know what that means. That's a way of talking about diversity that arose in roughly the mid-1980s. But if we're talking about a student on a campus learning things, you're living in a dorm, okay, you're going to learn how to deal with different sorts of people in certain ways. But to the extent that we say we need to jigger our admissions policies with that in mind, preparing them for what they're going to face in the workplace. They're in the workplace and there's a black person. Well, here's this black person. Well, it's a good thing that when I was at Columbia, I learned that when I'm dealing with black people, what? Fill in the blank.
Well, let me challenge you on that, because I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My community that I grew up in was 85% Hispanic. I'm white. I think I probably met 2 black people before I went to college. And I will say, there is a discomfort, which I think everyone in this room can identify if they've grown up in a homogeneous community. There is an initial discomfort and curiosity. Discomfort's the wrong word. Curiosity, learning to live with people of other backgrounds, other cultures, other races. If we know that people are entering workforces where they are perhaps more demographically and racially diverse than where they grew up, where they went to school, isn't part of teaching them to be able to be sensitive to the things that you might not be aware that someone who's Hispanic or black or white or Mormon might be sensitive to or might need you to understand them on that level?
Charles, I'm sorry. What would it be? I'm
Well,
not.
maybe Angel could step in here because he's talked about admissions officers being social engineers. So that seems to speak to this question. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah, and it's interesting, to your point, you know, I'll give you an example. And it's not necessarily what we teach, because maybe these conversations, yeah, some of them happen in the classroom, but a lot of it, I think, is what happens outside of the classroom. You know, I still remember my roommate was also from New York City, but he was a white male, very, very wealthy. And we had some of the most profound conversations, some of them very uncomfortable in the beginning of our freshman year, that really helped me to understand a very different part of society, really helped me to understand differences in culture, but also he, till this day, tells me, you know, you exposed me to a whole world I had no idea even existed. And I think the both of us are better as a result of that. And I see that happening on my campus every single day, where there's a lot of interaction between students of different socioeconomic classes, but also between students of different races, conversations. Some of that, back to your point, we create. So we want to make sure that we have orientation programs and that we have, you know, forums to make sure this conversation happens. But what the students are telling us is that it's what happens outside of the classroom, that they have to put themselves in situations where they are uncomfortable to a certain extent, and challenged by difference.
Notice that that makes pristine sense when it comes to socioeconomics. Yes, you're going to talk to somebody who grew up in a different way, and that person is going to enlighten you about what it was like. But the minute that becomes about being Chinese or being black, it falls apart because you end up thinking about stereotypes. And very quickly I will say, no, a black person telling you, well, the police are more likely to harm me or kill me than they are you, white person. That is an important lesson, but I don't think you need college to be taught that, especially these days. And if you get away from that, an issue which is very important to me, I don't think it works when we're talking about skin color and race. It works about life experience. That's how I feel about it.
But where else would people come together naturally to have these kinds of connections and discussions? I mean, we
College.
don't really, right.
Yeah, I think
we
it's
do it in
great for
college.
socioeconomics.
But if we're not, well, but if we admit a class based solely on socioeconomic, that may not necessarily happen because of the race construction. Not race construction, but the kinds of students we would admit.
I take your point. That's another thing. I don't want to mess up the time. But it's been shown that actually if you only take socioeconomics into account, actually you don't wind up with just the coal miner's daughter, which I was heartened to find, because at first I worried about what you were saying. It depends on what study.
Let's take a question from the audience. Yeah, there's one back here, if the mic's coming down to you.
Hi, I'm Beth Brieger. I'm the executive director of LIDA. I wanted to challenge your statement where you said that you don't see how going to a selective college can impact your ability to be a leader. The mayor himself said this morning that he traded on his education at Sarah Lawrence and Northwestern to do good in his position. For many of our students, we see that they gain admission to these institutions and they are essentially getting free access to social capital that many students who have this right to attend these institutions by their nature of privilege trade on throughout their entire lives. So I challenge you again, are not these institutions places that give leadership tools and leadership access to our nation's most talented students?
I understand the challenge, and one has to be careful with a particular two words, social capital. That is a way of putting it that actually I think stems in terms of how we use it from the work of Glenn Loury, who, like me, is very controversial on the affirmative action question. But yeah, social capital is important, but I'm not sure where it's been shown that the only place you can get it is one of those top 30 schools, or that once you go below it, you're getting so significantly less a degree of social capital that there is a crisis. My feeling is just we can't create what are visibly two-tier student bodies, which is what was going on before the ban of affirmative action in California and at many other schools. Social capital is very important, but it's not Yale or jail. There are degrees here.
Thank you all very much. We really appreciate you joining us today. It's a fascinating conversation. We will now be adjourning for lunch. If you wouldn't mind going downstairs, the Walton Family Foundation has put on a great lunch for you. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you so much.